You've been sitting with a problem for 3 hours. You know exactly who you could call, and you still haven't called. If that sounds familiar, there's a good chance you're the kind of person for whom asking for help carries a weight that most people around you simply don't feel. And psychology has a compelling explanation for why some people are built this way. Because people who struggle to ask for help aren't stubborn or proud or trying to prove something. They're usually navigating a very specific set of internal beliefs about what needing help means, beliefs that formed long before they were old enough to examine them. And it's worth saying early, this doesn't mean something is wrong with you. The difficulty with asking rarely comes from stubbornness or ego. It usually comes from somewhere much quieter and much older than that. Some people have lived with this quietly for years, the slow accumulation of problems handled alone, the help not asked for, the reaching out that never quite happened. Others will recognize someone close to them in this, the person who will spend 2 hours solving something alone that a single phone call would have resolved in 5 minutes, and who still won't make the call. There's a particular internal experience that people in this category tend to share, and it runs underneath almost every situation where help is available but not taken. Something becomes difficult. A problem at work, a situation at home, an emotional weight that's been accumulating for longer than it should have. And there's a moment, sometimes a clear one, where you know that someone in your life could help, where you can identify the specific person and probably even the specific thing you'd say. And you don't say it. You close the door on that option quietly, and you turn back to managing it yourself. It doesn't feel like avoidance in the moment. It feels like a decision, like the independent handling of something that is yours to handle. But underneath that feeling, if you go looking for it, there's usually something else, a low-level discomfort with what asking would require you to be in that moment, which is someone who needs something. And for reasons that often trace back much further than the current situation, that's a position some people find genuinely difficult to occupy. Psychologists who study how people seek and avoid support have found something consistent. The barrier to asking for help is almost never logistical. It's almost always psychological. And at the center of it, for many people, is a deeply held equation between needing help and being inadequate. Not a conscious belief necessarily, more like a background assumption that operates below the level of deliberate thought. The feeling that competent people handle things. That asking is admitting you couldn't, that the moment you reach out, something about how you're perceived by the other person and by yourself will shift in a direction you don't want it to shift. This equation gets built early, sometimes in environments where self-sufficiency was the explicit value, where adults modeled handling things alone, where needing help wasn't something that was done in that family, where children absorbed the implicit message that struggle was private and asking was weakness. Sometimes it was more specific than that, a moment or a series of moments where reaching out produced something that didn't feel safe, where the help that came was conditional or critical or came attached to something that made the asking feel costly. And so the lesson learned, clearly and early, was to stop asking. There are some very specific ways this shows up in ordinary life. It's possible you've been in a situation where someone offered you help, genuinely, warmly, with no strings attached, and you said you were fine. Not because you were fine, but because accepting felt complicated in a way you couldn't quite articulate. Like receiving the help would create a debt, or shift the dynamic, or require you to be in a position of vulnerability with that person that felt harder to manage than whatever you were struggling with alone. Or maybe you've noticed the way you tend to wait until a problem is almost completely resolved before you mention it to anyone, as if the acceptable time to share difficulty is after the difficulty is over. When it's a story rather than a request. When you can present it from the position of someone who handled it, rather than someone who is in it. Or there's the internal negotiation that happens when something genuinely goes wrong. The mental list of reasons why each person you could call isn't quite the right person. They're busy, they have their own things, it's not serious enough to bother them with. You'll figure it out, and the list is always long enough to justify not reaching out, even when you know, somewhere underneath it, that any one of those people would want to help. And sometimes it shows up even smaller than that. Someone notices you're struggling and offers to take something off your plate, and before you've even thought about it, you've already said, "I've got it." Not because you have it, but because saying otherwise didn't feel like an option that was really available. There's a dimension of this that's worth slowing down for, because it's one of the more counterintuitive pieces of the pattern. People who struggle to ask for help are often among the most generous helpers available when someone else needs something. They respond quickly. They show up without being asked twice. They anticipate what others need before it's stated. And they're often genuinely baffled by the gap between how naturally giving feels and how difficult receiving is. Psychologists who study how people relate in close relationships have noticed this asymmetry. A strong and comfortable capacity for giving combined with a genuine difficulty in the reverse direction. And what underlies it often is the same belief operating in both directions. Giving is something capable people do. Receiving is something people do when they aren't capable of managing alone. The person has placed themselves somewhere in their own internal architecture firmly on one side of that line. What this means in practice is that the relationships closest to these people sometimes carry a quiet imbalance. Other people are allowed to be vulnerable, to need things, to show up imperfect and ask for support. And the person who struggles to ask holds themselves to a different standard, one they wouldn't dream of applying to anyone they love. There's another layer underneath this that's important to name carefully. For some people, the difficulty with asking for help isn't just about pride or self-sufficiency, it's about what they believe will happen if they let someone see them struggling. There's a fear, usually quiet and rarely articulated, that being seen in need will change something in how they're held by the people around them. That the version of them other people have come to rely on, the capable one, the one who holds things together, the one who manages, will be replaced by a different version that the relationship can't quite carry. This fear is almost always wrong. The people who love someone in this category typically have a much larger capacity to hold them than they've been allowed to demonstrate. But the belief persists because it was formed in a place where it may have been accurate, in an early environment where being seen struggling actually did produce something uncomfortable. And beliefs formed in childhood about what vulnerability costs are among the most resistant to revision through adult experience. What starts to shift things usually isn't an argument against the belief. It's an experience that contradicts it, a moment when someone asks for help and the help comes without conditions, and nothing shifts in the way they feared, and the relationship is actually closer afterward than it was before. That experience, happening enough times with the right people, slowly rewrites the equation. It's worth sitting with what maintaining this pattern actually costs over time. Not just practically, though the practical costs are real. The exhaustion of handling everything alone, the problems that get larger because they were managed solo longer than they needed to be, but relationally, because relationships require a certain amount of mutual vulnerability to become genuinely close. Not performed vulnerability, not strategic disclosure, but the real thing. Letting someone see you when you're not managing well and allowing them to respond. People who consistently don't do this often find, after years, that their relationships feel slightly thinner than they'd like, that people care about them clearly, but don't quite know them, that there's a kind of closeness available that hasn't been reached because it requires an exchange that keeps getting declined on one side. The wall isn't hostile, it's protective, but it keeps out the same things it's trying to guard against. People who struggle to ask for help often aren't less trusting than other people. They're simply more practiced at handling things alone. The independence is real. The capability is real. But somewhere underneath it is a very old belief that needing something changes how you're seen. An unlearning that takes time, and the right experiences and people who stay when you finally let them in. So the next time you find yourself working through something difficult alone, long past the point where reaching out would have helped, it might not mean you're too proud, or that independence is just who you are, or that the people around you couldn't hold what you'd be sharing. It might simply mean your mind is wired to protect you from a vulnerability that once carried a cost it no longer does. That the pattern was built for an older version of your circumstances. and the people around you now are more capable of receiving you than the original lesson suggested. Asking for help isn't a subtraction from who you are. It's an invitation for someone else to be close to what's real. And the people who matter will not think less of you for it. They'll think more. So now I'm curious. Are you someone who tends to struggle to ask for help? Who handles things alone far longer than necessary? Who finds receiving harder than giving? Or are you more the opposite? Someone who reaches out fairly easily, who doesn't attach much weight to needing support? Drop it in the comments. And if you've ever realized, after finally asking, that the asking was easier than you'd made it in your head, I'd genuinely like to hear that too.